Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to this second session of R&D Unplugged. Very glad to have you here. R&D Unplugged is a series that we organize at LPI, at the Business Unit Learning Transitions, which is about communicating research results in simple terms and in a short way. So it's really half an hour tops. And today we're very proud and honored to have Iveta Silova, professor at ASU. And without further ado, Iveta, I hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much, colleagues from the Learning Planet Institute and CISRD for making my visit to Paris possible. I'm very, very excited to be here to reconnect with many of the people that I have known for several years and to meet all of the new people as well. So thank you for joining today and for openness to explore some of the ideas. So I would like today, at ASU, I'm professor of education policy and innovation at Peters College, and also senior Global Futures Scholar with a Global Futures Lab at ASU. And I also serve as an Associate Dean of Global Engagement. So my role is also to support and grow our international partnerships, including with the institutions here in France. So I'm really, really excited and happy to be here. And also, just a real quick heads up, we are planning to bring a group of students from ASU to LPI next spring. So it will be an opportunity also not for researchers and faculty members to collaborate, but also for students to do more work together and get to know each other. So this is something to look forward to in the near future. But today I wanted to share some of my own research with you. And of many things that I do, I chose maybe a little bit more provocative title for my presentation and wanted to focus on education beyond the human. And placing this topic within the context of the Anthropocene. And it's hard to imagine usually education happening beyond the human because historically it has been so human-centered. But I believe, and that's the provocation I want to set for us as well, that we have to begin thinking beyond those limitations and begin to imagine and practice learning with AI, but also with nature and other beings as well, right? Not only learning from other humans. So just this is very, very short. But I wanted first to set the scene a little bit, and all of you, I'm sure, are familiar with all of the statistics. So this is the really interesting graph that summarizes so much of what's going on right now. So it shows that undeniably that the global crisis is happening and it's escalating very quickly. It also shows that the scientific community has responded very in a very determinate way. So since 1970, for example, there has been so much scientific evidence, right, that the climate crisis is escalating. So we have hundreds of thousands of scientific articles and research that has been conducted to give us evidence, right? We also have major advocacy and activism that has been happening, right? From political leaders to youth activists that are on the streets, right? Millions of people that are organizing and mobilizing to respond. We also have so many international agreements that have been signed and ratified and acted upon. So, and despite all of this work that we do in terms of research and advocacy, and like at the international agreement cooperation level, yet the indicators of the climate crisis continue to escalate only, right? So there is obviously something that is happening that we are not paying attention to, right? And so what we see is that as of today, 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries have already been crossed. And And it's a really fast kind of escalation rate too, from 2009, when only 3 boundaries have been crossed, to 2003. So this is last year when it was officially documented, right, that we crossed 6 of the boundaries already. And so Johan Rockström from Sweden, who works on the planetary boundary stuff, basically says that, he says that very soon the changes will be irreversible. But as you know, many young people already think that the changes are irreversible, right? What we see and observe like on a daily basis around us, it clearly shows evidence that so much is irreversible already. And so I very purposefully included some of the youth artwork together with the scientific evidence, because all of it, all forms of expression show how urgent the climate crisis is. And so the question is, how are we responding to it in the education community, right? So we have seen the scientists are producing a lot of work, the climate activists are on the streets, but what are we as educators, as education policymakers, as education practitioners, what are we doing to contribute to this? And I want to argue that we are not doing things fast enough, and we are also not acting radically enough. This is just wanted to show you this very short clip from an exhibition in Hong Kong that features 13 hyper-realistic life-size sculptures of white old men in wheelchairs that are it's a symbolic representation of the UN, basically, right? Just pointlessly, without any purpose, moving around, bumping into each other. And so to me, it actually, when I first saw this, to me, it really seemed like a very grotesque parody also of what we are doing in the education space, right? And kind of more broadly to respond to the climate crisis. So why are we failing to respond? Why are we moving as the, so slowly and not radically enough? And so most of the conversations, right, about education response to the climate crisis revolves around these barriers that we need to address. So we usually talk about these very technical issues of what we in education should do. So this is a research by one of my colleagues, Tristan McCowan from UCL in London. So, he talks about how there are financial limitations of higher education institutions or education institutions, right? We have limited resources, no specific budget, or competing priorities to respond to the climate crisis. There are logistical issues like poor infrastructure, unsuitable materials, so inadequate space. There are political barriers, technical barriers. So very technical discussion about why we are failing to respond radically enough. But I want to suggest today that one of the main barriers that we don't really talk much about is actually a cultural barrier. And here I talk about the culture more in terms of the patterns of sense making that materialized in actual practices, everyday lives, societal institutions, kind of culture very broadly defined. And in my research with my colleagues in Kyoto University, we have been also kind of articulating the concept of culture in terms of how we think about ourselves, our selfhood, right? So we have been working with these ideas of independent versus interdependent selfhood and how that translates into the culture. And just maybe to show you really quickly the research that we have done. So what we argue is that the cultural dimensions, when we kind of articulate them within this independent versus interdependent selfhood, that they very strongly relate not only with people's environmental attitudes, but also with their actual environmental impacts. So countries with the strongest individualism, and these are most of the Western countries and Northern countries, basically they tend not to accept anthropogenic cause of climate change, and they tend to have great environmental impact on Earth, right? So there is a really interesting correlation there in terms of culture, right? And how we see ourselves in relation to each other, but also in relation to the world, right? So this, the idea that we see ourselves as independent from each other and independent from and separate from nature versus interdependent with each other and with nature as well. So, and I want to offer 3 provocations to open it as a discussion, as a, as a collective. One is that the crisis of the Anthropocene is not a crisis of, it's not the problem that we cannot find technoscientific solutions fast enough, but it's really a crisis of it's a cultural crisis. We cannot we cannot change our own selves fast enough. That education is very deeply implicated in this cultural crisis, and that our survival and planetary well-being depend on our capacity to imagine and find new ways of living with each other and with the planet. So I'll start with the first one, that the crisis of the Anthropocene is a cultural crisis, basically the crisis of questioning modernist thought. And so here I work with the ideas of what many researchers refer to as the root metaphors of modernity, kind of the ideas that are at the foundations of Western philosophy and political economy, ideas such as progress, infinite growth, hierarchy, human exceptionalism, neoliberal individualism, universality, kind of the ideas that shape how we see ourselves in the world, right? And how we also relate to the world. And one of the key also root metaphors is viewing nature as a machine rather than as a living being. And so one of my, I do a lot of work with ecofeminism, and one of my, Carolyn Merchant is one of the influential feminist writer who has done amazing work at tracing historically how we began separating ourselves from nature and how we began recasting nature as a machine and kind of what consequences that had. How it really set the stage for the exploitation of both human and natural resources in the name of progress, how it led to the domination of some humans over other humans based on race, gender, class, and ability, but how it's really the same mechanism also that allowed us to justify exploitation of nature, right? That it's a similar logic of domination that creates the hierarchies and that allow us to live in unsustainable ways. And it relates, actually, it's the same logic of dominations that also we see a lot in the conversation right now that are framed as humans versus AI, right? Also, it's the same idea that we often approach these relationship with AI with the same logic of domination where we try to control and manage and not learn with or together. And here I wanted to bring my other colleague, Vanessa Andriotti from Canada, who has done really interesting work and recently published a book called Hospicing Modernity. And so she proposes that this concept is so, it outgrown itself. And she proposes that we hospice modernity, and she describes hospicing as this process of a place of transition, basically allowing modernity to expire gracefully within us without judgment for its manifest failings. We hold its program of violence and separation and open the space to reclaim a deeper understanding of what it is to be human, right? So, and if you remember the exhibit from Hong Kong with the old violators in wheelchairs bumping into each other aimlessly. So I think to me that also is a really perfect metaphor for this hospicing that needs to happen, right? And how do we do it in ways that are respectful but that open the space for alternatives to be to manifest, right, and to be in dialogue and to begin major radical change. So Vanessa Andriotti and her colleagues from the Decolonial Futures Collaborative work with the idea of the house of modernity, right? So they propose that there is a house of modernity, basically, is that we need to pay real attention to. And of course, it has the enlightenment or human centeredness, capitalism as some of the main blocks of this house of modernity, right? Or hierarchy or separability, again, so separation of humans from nature. And others, right? And so they show basically how this house of modernity is cracking, and what can we do then to hospice it respectfully. But what's interesting is that we don't really talk much about the schoolhouse of modernity, right? So there is a house of modernity, but there's also a schoolhouse that actually really makes modernity, reproduces it, right? And has served for centuries to reproduce modernity on a global scale, especially through the idea of modern schooling. So what I want to argue is that education is really deeply implicated in the climate crisis, because this is where we very purposefully learn the ideas of separating humans from nature, from where we learn about human exceptionalism and more. So I created with AI this picture of the schoolhouse of modernity. And I was telling Francois earlier how difficult it actually was to work with AI to create the picture of the schoolhouse of modernity, because when I shared first with AI the previous picture I showed you of the house of modernity that has a cracking walls and foundations, and asked to create a schoolhouse of modernity. So what AI created for me first was a super stable, palace-like building of the school. And the more I asked it to approach it more critically, the evolution became even more interesting, because it then looked like a prison. It then looked like a bank, but always with super strong walls and foundations, right? And like almost indestructible, which is really interesting, and I think also really shows how this idea of modern schooling is so strongly ingrained in our minds as the only way to learn and to be, that it's very difficult to start imagining alternatives. So I spent a lot of time working with AI, and then ended up actually graffitiing the schoolhouse of modernity myself to make it more real, right? And as you see here, so this schoolhouse of modernity, where we do learn about infinite economic growth as a normal link to education, right? It's where we learn about human exceptionalism, where we learn about progress at the expense of others and at the expense of nature, right? Where we learn about universalism and let's see, hyper-separation from nature, ecocide, empire, like a lot of the problematic issues. I also put the smokestacks on the roof of the schoolhouse of modernity, also because of how deeply education is implicated in the fossil fuel industry as well, right? So there are lots of connections there. Anyways, so education is deeply implicated, but we don't really talk about how education could be reformed in radical ways to move into alternatives. Well, we do in this room, but I think in policy dialogues globally, these conversations are missing. And so my provocation is, how do we open these conversations? How do we move these conversations into the global education policy dialogues as well, and grassroots conversations as well? But really quickly, before we move here, I just wanted to show you also this graph from the research that I have done with my colleagues in Kyoto University, where we try to show the relationship between education and CO2 emissions per capita, basically showing that there is a positive correlation between the lower secondary completion rate and the per capita CO2 emissions, and between the percentage of students with fixed level of proficiency in literacy and numeracy. So basically it shows that the countries with better education tend to have more detrimental effects on climate change, right? So the more education you have, the higher your ecological footprint usually is, which is not really a surprise, but we don't really talk about education in this way, right? But it, I think, implicates in education and in the climate crisis very directly. So, and again, as a provocation, I want to say that, so today we are in the world that is the most educated it has ever been, yet we are also the closest to the environmental collapse, right? So the more scientifically literate we become, the more we lose our basic earth literacy. And another philosopher that I really like reading to is David Abram, who talks about how the more literate we become, then at the same time, the stones fall silent, the trees become mute, the other animals dumb, and the ancient stories lose their dreaming power. So we lose the earth literacy, right? So we lose the ability to listen to the stones, to speak with the trees, to connect with nature in other ways. And we're seeing as human literacy rates escalate, forests disappear, species go extinct, and we are moving even more rapidly towards the ecological collapse. But when we again look at the global education scene, there is consistently calls for more education, right? So that the solution to the climate crisis is more education. So this is the latest report by the World Bank that talks about links to education and climate crisis, and basically says that positions education as the main solution, saying that all we need is open education to more people, increase access to education, and increase quality of education, and it would automatically help us solve the climate crisis. Yet we know that this is not necessarily the case, as I just showed you earlier, right? We today have the highest literacy rates, yet this has really helped us move to address the climate crisis. And it's interesting too, and you can't really see it, but still, they talk about reduced education attainment will translate into lower earnings and productivity. And so lower earnings and slow down economic growth is still the main concern, right? Not the ecological well-being of the people and the planet, and not even the idea of survival. So the ability to grow GDP and grow earnings is still the priority. And this is a dominant narrative in the education policy space, right? So how do we disrupt it? So, and so the idea is the assumption in these global policy circles is that more and better education would equal sustainability. Again, assumptions that we will have more educated people who will be able to come up with better techno-scientific solutions, so we will be fine. But we know that's not really the case, and better education doesn't translate into sustainability. So I guess the argument I want to try to make is that we need a very different type of education. More of the same type of education will not help us solve the problem. And our colleague David Orr has said that many years ago already, but again, this message does not really resonate in global policy circles. So he talks about how more of the same kind of education will only compound our problems. We need to move away from this schoolhouse of modernity into more radical reimagination of education that maybe reconnects us both with each other, with the planet, and with other species, whether it's human, more than human, or AI. And our survival really depends on our capacity to re-articulate the dominant culture, basically re-articulate who we are and how we relate to each other while reimagining and learning new ways to live with each other and with the earth. And I argue that it's beyond the human. So eco-feminist, again, our eco-feminist colleagues very poetically call us to free our minds, make our own contributions to the project of disrupting reductionism and mechanism, help us reimagine the world in richer terms that will allow us to find ourselves in dialogue and limited by other species' needs, other kinds of minds. They say that the struggle is to think differently, to remake this reductionist culture, that it's a basic survival project in our present context. So this is Val Plumwood, an eco-feminist philosopher from Australia that passed away a few years ago. A basic survival project is basically not more technoscientific solutions, but it's redefining who we are in relation to each other and the planet. And education is so critical to this project, to this survival project. So then the question is, how do we activate a cultural shift? And very briefly, I will, just touch on some of the ideas. We have to delink education from economic growth and GDP. This is the only way we measure education success, unfortunately, still, right? This is a dominant way. And we need to very urgently redefine education purposes in broader ecological terms. And really acknowledge that human and planetary and more than human fates and futures are very deeply interconnected. All the artworks that I'm using here is from the socially engaged art projects that we have done with our students by crowdsourcing Hugh's visions of education futures. So all that you see here is that have been already ways to reimagine this future that are ongoing. Another one is reconfiguring our own selves for a different future, not learning about the world as we usually do in schools and universities, but really figure out new ways of learning with the world, not being separate from the world, but really locating ourselves in the world and begin to learn together with the world, acknowledging that humans are embedded within ecosystems that are ecological, and that we are ecological, not only social beings. We are much more than social beings, beyond the human, right? Always already embedded in ecosystems. And cultivating the ecological consciousness, again, in much broader terms, beyond our own social consciousness. Well, in other terms, many people use this idea also of moving from ego to eco, with, the human is on the top of the pyramid, to eco consciousness, was the human is part of the larger community. And this has to do with AI as well, right? From the other extreme. Another one of my favorite eco-feminist writers, Donna Haraway, scholar, was writing about cyborgs that is a blend of people, human and machine already 3 decades ago, right? In the 1980s, she was already writing about this. How a hybrid of machine and organism, where the boundary between human and animal and machine is transgressed, that how it's synonymous with hybrids and chimeras and mosaics. She writes about how a cyborg world might be about lived social and bodily realities in which people are not afraid of their joint kinship with animals and machines, not afraid of permanently partial identities and contradictory standpoints, right? So how do we move beyond the sphere of being with others, whether it's with AI or with nature? How do we lose our urge for control and domination? The just real quick example I wanted to give at ASU, we have this new the Future of Being Human initiative, which is really fascinating. It's actually mostly focused on AI and how do we redefine what it means to be human in the context of AI. Asking questions, 100 years from now, what would it like to, what would it mean to be human, right? And what do we need today to be able to survive this and create a meaningful relationship, right, with AI? And I would argue also with nature. So to me, it's just two maybe extremes, right? The relationship with nature and relationship with AI need to be redefined probably on very similar terms. And And what does this mean for the future of the university and for the future of the school as well, right? For the futures of the K-12 schooling as well. This future of being human initiatives is based on these principles of obsessive curiosity, radical creativity, respectful inclusivity, grounded exuberance, and catalytic serendipity, right? And actually also use the tagline, the future of being human, unplugged. It's a really nice connection. And another example of how many synergies we have between our institutions too, right? I think there are lots of ideas and research and imaginings that are happening in parallel, or at least on the same playing field. So I think more collaboration and exchange of ideas and kind of pushing the limits and the boundaries would be just so exciting, both between the researchers and the students and all of the communities within which we operate. But again, I wanted to end with this quote by Val Plumwood because I love her work so much. So she says that this failure of our response to the ecological crisis is really a failure of our imagination, nothing else. She says if our species does not survive the ecological crisis, it probably will be due to our failure to imagine and work out new ways to live with the earth. As we will go onwards in a different mode of humanity or not at all. So I will end on this quote, emphasizing the urgency of redefining who we are and mobilizing the power of education to create this radical cultural shift that will help us redefine how we relate to each other, to others, other species, and to the planet more broadly. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Iveta. Are there any questions in the room first? Yes, Claire? Speak loud.
Hi. I'm wondering, to me, a lot of things came more from the spiritual side, and why that was perhaps so the cultural, where the spiritual kind of go inside. Do you include these things as a separate? Because I think for me it's perhaps much more of a spiritual crisis than it is a cultural. But I'm also not sure how you were defining cultural, because it feels like it's very much also in relation to our economy, to our education, etc.
Yeah.
But then you talk a lot about nature connection and our relationship with the environment. And to me that is an eco. It's much more spiritual. So
Yeah. So great question. Thank you so much. I think what we are trying to work with the concept of culture in much broader terms. It also includes spiritual connections, right? And that actually include other different types of knowledges and ways of being. So the more in terms of culture that opens up space for multiple ways of being and ways of knowing. So, and spiritual connections are absolutely also there as well. And I think that's why also some of the works that we have done in the past, recently with my colleagues, is also talking about how do we also move beyond the maybe Western horizon of how we imagine ways of being and living, right? Because a lot of also what we maybe could term culture in other societies is defined and practiced, right, in ways that are more connected, both in terms of, connectedness and relations with people, but also with land and for that matter with AI as well.
More questions?
Maybe I would like to add that discussion and have some of the speakers about Christ knowledge, Christ crisis of knowledge, and it's about the positive way to see the scientific knowledge. So we can come the power of this. And so it's because in Latin America have this kind of discussion about crisis of knowledge, but also one critical perspective. So now authors are speaking about capitalism.
Yeah.
A really good discussion about how is the economy structural.
So, and we talk also I work very much also with decolonial literature that really critiques the idea of the universal knowledge, right, and universality, and also really pushes to create spaces for other knowledges and worlds and worldviews to coexist, right, on a non-hierarchical basis. And so I think that's really critical for moving forward in a more meaningful way, and also really critical for our survival. Because again, a lot of the indigenous knowledges have so much wisdom about surviving, right, and coexisting, with nature, that we are not really taking into consideration. So again, in our education institutions, especially in universities, how do we create the space to bring all of these different knowledges, right? And learn from each other, again, on a non-hierarchical basis. But it's super difficult to overcome this. So I was actually looking at there was an interesting article maybe a couple of years ago in New York Times that talked about climate scientists that were boycotting research because their research is not used by policymakers, right, anymore. But the articles, and also basically saying, why should we even do this if it's not? So this is science research, right, on climate. But this article that linked to another really fascinating work that showed how 99.9% of federal funding in the United States went for climate science research, and 0.1 or 2% went to social sciences and humanities. So we know so much about these technical scientific solutions, right? But we also have not been investing at all in any of the humanities or social sciences or other knowledges that have a lot of wisdom in helping us, both work with the scientific knowledge, right? But also complement it, and also maybe sometimes challenge the technoscientific solutions, right? So it's there are so many layers of complexity there that are super interesting to think about. And but I think the bottom line is we need much more than technoscientific solutions, right? We need to create spaces for different knowledges to be part of the conversation.
Ed?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm just wondering your experience as well around sharing this with students.
Mhm.
And you mentioned about creating that meeting space at the university is so critical. How have you found this kind of work is being received by students directly, say, for instance, in your department, but also what are the reactions of maybe those that are not so directly connected to this theme of work? Because you mentioned how so many of these themes stretch across so many of the departments of research and areas of research. Do you find that it resonates in the same way across each of those or not?
So I have two examples, okay? So one is, at our own university. So our president, Michael Crow, recently started speaking about these issues very directly. And the first time he spoke about it was maybe 2 years ago at the opening of the Center for Planetary Health. And he said, I know it will be really controversial and I want to be on record. And so he wanted to be recorded. And then afterwards, he actually wrote about it in a recent book, where he wrote a chapter, the book called Democracy in a Harder Time. So he has a chapter on education there. But he very directly basically said how universities are implicated in the climate crisis, how it's us as the researchers that for centuries have been creating knowledge that led to the separation of humans from the land, that justified exploitation of nature by humans in the name of progress, right? Basically, called on all of us researchers, faculty, and students to now begin working to change this, right? Because we think it's also our responsibility to then begin redefining all of the maybe repairing all of the damage that we as researchers and education institutions have done over the centuries, right? So really, really direct goal. And when you hear a university president speak this way, I think it not only resonates with other faculty, not all, not for sure, not all, right? But it's, there is a more likelihood to, like, for these ideas to resonate with faculty and students, right? And for more conversations to start. So at the end of the summer in August, we will have like the whole 2 days dedicated to the discussions of democracy and education in a harder time, right? And the discussions will revolve around these questions. So this was one example I wanted to give, but I wanted to give also another example, which is really fascinating. So I spent my sabbatical in Finland just this last fall. And one of the universities that I visited, I was not hosted there, was at the University of Jyväskylä, who has a really interesting group of philosophers. They call themselves a wisdom group, but philosophers, right? Working with different philosophies, Western, non-Western, indigenous. And so they wrote this very short kind of opinion piece on planetary well-being. And then they decided that they would work with every single school and department at the University of Jyväskylä to go deeper into this concept of planetary well-being in relation of what it means to every discipline where these colleagues are located. So they, for a couple of years, worked really hard with people in business, in accounting, in arts, in engineering, to write basically essays on planetary well-being in engineering or accounting, right? And published a book which is open access online. And when I came there, they had a book tour in their own university where they would come to every department basically to have discussions about this. And I happened to be there when they had a discussion in the accounting department about planetary well-being. And I have to tell you, it was the most fascinating discussion I have ever heard, right? Because I never heard accountants talk about what is their contribution to the planetary well-being, right? And the way they structured this discussion was really inspiring, and it just drew people in, and you could not react, right? So people were kind of really pulled into that conversation. So I think there are ways to stir the pot and initiate discussions at different levels, right? And there are really interesting attempts at how people are doing. So we have tried to do it also like through socially engaged art with students by crowdsourcing their visions and then putting those ideas in conversation with policymakers. So there are lots of experiments, and we have to try all we can, I think, to kind of make the space for this type of experiments and push, ways to push the boundaries.
Catherine?
Yes, thank you so much, Iveta. It's really inspiring to hear about your work. And I really love how you also spotlighted these other researchers and saying, I love this person's work, I love that. That's what we need as well. But I'm just curious, coming from an African perspective, because as a South African, I often am critical of global North, like well-intentioned ideas, but how would they translate in an African context or in the South African context from my perspective, for example? So I'm just curious what kind of collaboration you have across the African continent, across other areas in South Asia or in Latin America, and how that would translate into those contexts specifically in terms of development, because I know, as you were saying, a lot of the time, education is seen as the key to unlocking higher living standards and better quality of life for a lot of people who are at the bottom of the income distribution. So I would really like to know how you grapple with those questions of inequality when it comes to this as well.
Grapple a lot, but I think my approach has been for maybe the last decade was really to form networks and connect with as many people as possible, also beyond my own context, right? And so I have done so much collaborative work with colleagues in very different contexts. And our latest project, and LPI is part of it as well, is actually build a network of networks that share similar maybe vision, which is related to this, I hope. But that includes also networks from the African continent and from Asia and from the South America, right? But, really try to mobilize forces and instead of competing with each other, find ways of collaborating so that we can collectively push, right, for change. So this was also an experiment, right? And super difficult to organize and move forward. But so this work on this building a network of networks actually is funded by the National Science Foundation in the US, that it recognizes building these networks also is really important, right? That we cannot really solve any of the issues in isolation. So I think it also is linked to the whole idea of interdependence. So we really need to work collaboratively with colleagues across all continents. And actually it was also really interesting. We had a discussion in this network meetings, how important it is also not to think of a network of networks with a backbone that is Western and Northern, right? But maybe think about it more as what is it called, Olivia? What is it? Not the flock of starlings, what is it called? Starling enumerations, right? That move birds that move, starling enumerations that move together at the same time, right? But they are connected, but they move towards the same purpose, right? So how do we also structure the networks in such a ways that are not hierarchical, right? Where our colleagues from the African continent or Asian context are not just data gatherers, right? And we are the ones that theorize, but how do we do it together? And it's really difficult to do. But I think there are also more and more mechanisms that allow for such collaborations now, including funding from NSF, which is really, really huge. That was not possible before. And I will be in June, so NSF and EU are actually now trying to create also joint funding for doing the network of network collaborations, to supporting those.
We're running out of time, but there's one question. Please keep it short.
Yes. First, what's the name of the book?
Oh yeah, it's called Planetary Wellbeing. It's super interesting and really, really, I can't believe they did it.
Okay.
It's very bold.
Thank you very much for using the artwork. I really interesting detail, and it really helped me understand a little bit more of what you're talking about. And you mentioned that we need to lose the urge for dominant control, especially of nature, going forward and but this is what is taught in our education systems.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to find out what's the next step, or where do we start altogether, losing this urge of dominance and control? Do you have any examples of something that's happening somewhere, or any ideas that have come forward, or where to begin?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it begins here. And we are all part of it, right? I think it begins here. And also with our collaborations, maybe as a next step, right? But also I wanted to say that there are so many already alternatives that exist that we don't really bring into focus or into the policy dialogue, right? A lot of the indigenous practices are already doing this, right? They are living in a very different relationship with the land, right? And other species. Yet very rarely do, these experiences are part of the agenda at a global level, right? So it may be mentioned very briefly in the Futures of Education report by UNESCO, right? But then often fails to really be promoted in practice. So it would never appear, or at least for a long time, in the World Bank report, the recommendations for funding, right? But I think I think also our maybe responsibility as researchers and academics is to make these alternatives visible and kind of, push them also into the public space and the public dialogue and, curriculum options and, policy options as well. But also it's bringing the existing, I think, alternatives into focus and into dialogue, but also creating new ones too. And I think that is really exciting to, to think together what are other ways to begin both, I think, the existing practices and experiences and, probably creating also new ways of learning, right?
Okay,
Including like contributions of young people, right? Because again, so the whole idea of how the, education systems and schooling are structured with these hierarchies of how some people know more than others, and children and young people know the least and contribute the least, it just doesn't work anymore.
perfect. A round of applause again. This is the end of the lecture. We can push the button.
No, we should do it.